Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, do you keep old letters, their ink long faded, tucked in some quiet drawer? Watson believed that paper never truly lies, though it may be persuaded to whisper falsehoods if one fails to look closely enough. Do subscribe, that no forged word escapes your notice. Now turn the page, for as Holmes so often reminded us, it is the little things that are infinitely the most important. Find us also on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel, link in the description below. Chapter 1. The Fog at Baker Street. It was, I recall, one of those dense yellow fogs peculiar to London in the last days of November, when the very air seems to thicken into a substance one might almost grasp in the hand, and the gas lamps of Baker Street burned each within its own small and jaundiced halo, powerless to illuminate anything beyond a few feet of greasy pavement. I had come round to the old rooms that morning at the invitation of a note from Holmes, brief even by his own economical standards, which read only, "Come if you can. There is a matter developing that may interest you. S.H." Such an invitation from such a man was not one I was inclined to refuse, whatever the state of the weather. I found him in his dressing gown, seated cross-legged upon the hearth-rug in a fashion more suited to an Eastern mendicant than to the foremost reasoning machine of the age, surrounded by a positive snowdrift of newspaper cuttings. He did not look up at my entrance, but continued to sort the clippings into small heaps, with the swift, precise movements of a card-player dealing hands. "You're examining something with great particularity," I observed, settling into my old chair by the fire. "Miscarriages of justice, unless I'm mistaken." "You're not mistaken, though I wonder that you should say so with such confidence." He glanced up then, and I saw that familiar spark kindle in his deep-set eyes. 3 cases in as many months, Watson, in which the written record of a court proceeding has been called into question by persons who swear they heard something other than what was set down. In each case the matter was dismissed as the fancy of grieving relatives. I begin to wonder whether English justice has developed a small and curious leak. I confess I thought little of this at the time, supposing it merely one of those intellectual appetites which Holmes indulged between more substantial cases, as another man might occupy himself with a crossword puzzle. I had no notion that within the hour we should be furnished with a 4th instance, and one destined to occupy us for a fortnight of the strangest reasoning I had yet witnessed. The bell rang below, and I heard Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stair, followed by a lighter and more hesitant step. She announced Mr. Edmund Lorimer, and there entered a gentleman of perhaps 55 years, dressed with the sober precision of his profession, his silk hat held before him like a shield, and his countenance betraying that particular anguish of a man unaccustomed to asking favours, who finds himself, through no fault of his own, compelled to do so. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I have been told that you concern yourself with matters the police consider closed, and I confess I know not where else to turn. Pray sit down, Mr. Lorimer, and take the basket chair. It is rather the more comfortable of the two. You're a solicitor, I perceive, and one who has of late spent a great many hours poring over documents by poor candlelight, to judge by the strain about your eyes. You have also," Holmes added, with a glance I'd come to recognise as his most searching, "travelled a considerable distance this morning in some haste, for you have retained your gloves in your left hand rather than pocketing them, a habit of men who do not expect to remain long, or who are too troubled to attend to the ordinary civilities." Lorimer's eyes widened. "You are quite right on every particular. I have come from Lincoln's Inn, and my business will not wait." He drew a folded packet of papers from his breast pocket with hands that trembled very slightly. "It concerns a young man named James Bellamy, a clerk in a shipping office, convicted a fortnight since of embezzlement before Sir Reginald Vale. The court record states that he was sentenced to 7 years' penal servitude. A severe sentence for a first offence of that character, unless the sum involved were very large," Holmes remarked. "That is precisely my difficulty, Mr. Holmes. I was present in court. I heard Sir Reginald pronounce the sentence with my own ears, and he said 7 months, not 7 years. I have made no error. I have argued cases before that judge for 11 years, and I know his voice and his manner of speech as I know my own. Yet the written record, certified and sealed, declares 7 years, and upon that record poor Bellamy is now confined." Holmes leaned forward, and I observed that particular sharpening of his glance which I had learned to associate with the scent of a genuine mystery. "You say the record has been certified. By whom?" "By Mr. Horace Weatherby, the court clerk, a man of unimpeachable reputation these 20 years. He insists that I am mistaken, that shock and affection for the family have confused my memory. Bellamy is, you must understand, the nephew of an old and dear friend of mine, and his sister, Miss Clara Bellamy, was likewise present and heard exactly what I heard. 2 witnesses, then, against a written record and the word of a respected clerk," said Holmes softly, and I saw him glance for an instant toward the window, where the fog pressed yellow and impenetrable against the glass, as though he sought there some reflection of the obscurity that lay before him. "You spoke, I think, a certain phrase a moment ago. Repeat it for me, if you would be so good, the exact words in which the record is expressed." Lorimer consulted his papers. "It reads, 'As entered upon the record, the prisoner James Bellamy is sentenced to 7 years penal servitude.'" I confess the phrase meant nothing to me, yet I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen at the words, "as entered upon the record," in a manner that told me he had already begun, in that swift and silent machinery of his mind, to construct some edifice of theory upon a foundation as yet invisible to myself. "Who else had access to the papers after judgment was given?" Holmes asked. "Myself, of course, Mr. Weatherby, the clerk, a messenger from the court office, and my own assistant, Mr. Ambrose Pike, who has been most diligent in helping me gather the documents for this very interview." Lorimer gestured toward the outer room. "He waits below, if you wish to question him." "Presently, perhaps." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and stood a long moment regarding the fog as though it were a curtain he might, by sheer intensity of will, draw aside. "You spoke also of a judge, Sir Reginald Vale, a man, I collect, of some severity but of unquestioned integrity. And there is a sister, Miss Clara Bellamy, and an inspector, Bradstreet, is it not, who generally handles matters of this district. You know him, then?" "We have had dealings," said Holmes with the faint dry smile I knew so well. "Mr. Lorimer, I will look into your case, though I will tell you plainly that the question which interests me is not merely whether a word was changed upon a page. Any dishonest clerk might alter a word, and any careless one might mistake it. The question that interests me is why any man should trouble himself to risk jail and disgrace merely to add 6 years and 5 months to the sentence of an obscure clerk in a shipping office. There is design in such precision, Mr. Lorimer, and where there is design, there is a purpose we have not yet discovered." I saw the solicitor's shoulders ease, if only a little, at these words, and as he took his leave, promising to send round young Pike that very afternoon with the fuller papers, I turned to my friend and found him already reaching for his pipe with the particular eagerness of a hound that has caught the first thread of a scent. "You think there is more in this than a clerical blunder," said I. "I think, Watson," he replied, striking a match, "that we are looking at one loose thread protruding from a garment whose pattern we cannot yet perceive. Somewhere in Lincoln's Inn, amid all that sealing wax and solemn language, a lie has been dressed in the clothing of an official record, and a lie that wears such clothing is generally a dangerous one." He drew upon his pipe, and through the blue smoke that curled toward the fog-dimmed window, I saw upon his face that expression of quiet, concentrated pleasure with which he always greeted the beginning of a chase worth the running. Chapter 2. A Respectable Error. We found Mr. Lorimer's chambers that afternoon much as one would expect of a solicitor of the old school. Dark panelling, a smell of leather and dust, and shelves sagging beneath the accumulated weight of 40 years' conveyancing. The fog had thinned somewhat by the time we reached Lincoln's Inn, though it had not lifted so much as retreated into every corner and archway, waiting, as it seemed to me, for the failing light of afternoon to summon it forth again. Lorimer received us with the documents already arranged upon his desk in a neat and melancholy row, as a man might lay out the effects of a deceased relative. "Here is the indictment," said he, touching each in turn. "Here the minutes of the court. Here the order for Bellamy's transfer to prison. And here the certified copy of the sentence itself." Holmes took up the last of these and held it to the window, tilting the page this way and that in the grey light. I looked over his shoulder and read the offending words myself. 7 years penal servitude, written in a clerkly hand, neither better nor worse than 1,000 such hands to be found in any court office in England. "You maintain that Sir Reginald said 7 months," Holmes said, without looking up from the page. "I maintain it because it is true," Lorimer replied, with the quiet doggedness of an honest man who has repeated himself too often to strangers. "Miss Bellamy will tell you the same. She very nearly wept with relief when she heard the word months, and I confess I felt something of the same relief myself, for we had feared far worse. And yet the clerk, Mr. Weatherby, disputes this. Weatherby is certain I misheard. He has been 30 years about the courts and prides himself, not unjustly, upon the accuracy of his ear. He says that grief plays strange tricks upon the memory, and I dare say a jury would find that argument more persuasive than my own protestations." A note of bitterness had crept into the solicitor's voice, the bitterness of a reasonable man confronted with the polite immovability of official certainty. It was at this point that a young man entered from the outer office bearing a further sheaf of papers and was introduced to us as Mr. Ambrose Pike. I studied him with some curiosity, given the part he had been described as playing in the collection of evidence, but I confess I found little in his appearance to reward the scrutiny. He was of middle height, sandy-haired, with the stooped and deferential bearing of a man who has spent his life in other men's shadows, and a face so entirely without distinction that I doubt I could have described it accurately an hour after leaving his company. He set down his papers, murmured some civility about the wretched weather, and stood a little apart as though conscious that the conversation was not properly his to join. "Mr. Pike has been of the greatest assistance," Lorimer said, "in gathering these very papers, and in compiling for you, Mr. Holmes, a list of every person who handled the sentence record between the moment of judgment and its delivery to the prison authorities." Pike produced the list with a small apologetic bow, as though offering something of trifling value. "I thought it might save you some little trouble," said he, in a voice as unremarkable as his countenance. "There were very few of us, in truth. Mr. Weatherby wrote the entry, a messenger carried it to be sealed, and I believe I myself carried the sealed packet to Mr. Lorimer's clerk the following morning. It is possible," he added, with a diffidence that seemed entirely natural, "that the shock of the sentence confused Miss Bellamy's recollection. Grief does strange things to the memory, does it not, Doctor?" He turned this last remark toward me, as though appealing to my professional authority, and I found myself murmuring some non-committal agreement before I had properly considered the question. Holmes had said nothing throughout this exchange, but had continued to examine the certified copy with an attention that seemed, to my eye, wholly disproportionate to so brief and formal a document. I saw him incline the page first toward the window, then away from it, and once he drew from his pocket the small lens he carried everywhere and bent low over a single word. "You find something of interest, Mr. Holmes?" Lorimer asked, unable to keep a note of hope from his voice. "I find a document of most exemplary neatness," Holmes replied, in a tone that revealed nothing. "It is a pleasure to examine papers so carefully prepared, in an age when so much official writing is executed in haste. Tell me, Mr. Pike, does the court customarily use a red sealing wax upon such records?" "I believe so, sir, though I confess I have never thought to look closely at the colour of a wax seal." Pike smiled faintly, as a man might smile at a question he considered charmingly irrelevant. "No more should you," said Holmes pleasantly, and returned the document to the desk. But I, who had learned over the years to read the small movements of my friend's countenance as other men read the morning paper, observed that he had marked something, and marked it well, though he gave no further sign of it before Lorimer. We remained above an hour longer, Holmes questioning Lorimer closely upon the sequence of events on the day of the trial. At what hour the court had risen, how long the papers had remained in the clerk's office before being sealed, whether the office had been left unattended at any point. Pike answered several of these questions himself, always readily, always with that same air of modest helpfulness, producing dates and hours from memory with the fluency of a man well accustomed to such details. I found myself rather admiring his diligence, and thought Lorimer fortunate in his assistant. It was not until we'd taken our leave and were walking back toward the Strand in search of a cab, the fog once more thickening about the lamp-posts, that Holmes broke a silence of some minutes' duration. "You noticed nothing remarkable in that room, Watson?" "Nothing beyond the ordinary melancholy of a case gone wrong," I confessed. "Lorimer is honest, I should say, and thoroughly wretched. Pike seems a decent, useful young fellow, if somewhat colourless." "Colourless," Holmes repeated, as though weighing the word upon some private scale. "That is well observed, though perhaps not in the sense you intend. As for the document, there was a blot of ink upon the certified copy, close by the word years, which lay very slightly raised above the surface of the page, as wax will lie when a page has been pressed and dried a second time after its first drying was complete. I have seen such a thing before, Watson, in a case of forged banknotes, though never before upon a document that carries the King's own justice within it." "You believe the record was altered then, after it was first written?" "I believe," said Holmes slowly, drawing his coat more closely about him against the raw evening air, "that the question is not so simple as alteration, nor so simple as error. Someone took a very great deal of trouble over that single word, Watson, and men do not take such trouble without a reason worth the risk. I do not yet know what that reason is, but I begin to suspect it is not the reason any of us in that room this afternoon would readily have imagined." He said no more upon the subject that evening, and I, knowing his moods, did not press him, though I confess the raised blot of ink remained fixed in my thoughts long after we had returned, through the deepening fog to the lighted windows of Baker Street. Chapter 3. The Prison Transfer. 2 days passed without word from Lorimer, during which Holmes occupied himself, so far as I could tell, with nothing more urgent than a monograph upon the varieties of cigar ash, an occupation he pursued with such single-minded devotion that I began to wonder whether the matter of the falsified record had slipped entirely from his thoughts. I ought to have known better. Holmes's mind, when engaged upon a problem, resembled nothing so much as a underground stream, invisible upon the surface yet flowing on beneath with steady and purposeful current, until it broke forth again at some point of its own choosing. It broke forth on the Thursday morning, when we were roused before 9 by a hurried and disordered ringing of the bell, followed almost at once by the appearance of Miss Clara Bellamy in our sitting-room, still in her outdoor things, her bonnet askew, and her countenance white with an agitation she made no effort to conceal. "Mr. Holmes, they have taken him away," she cried, before Mrs. Hudson had properly announced her. "James has been removed from the local prison and sent to Dartmoor, though his appeal has not yet been heard. Mr. Lorimer says it is most irregular, that such transfers are not commonly made until a case is settled beyond question, and I am quite certain, Mr. Holmes, that it has been done to bury the whole matter before anyone can set it right." Holmes rose and drew a chair close to the fire for her. His manner gentled at once into that particular graveness he reserved for witnesses in genuine distress, so different from the brisk incisiveness with which he questioned those he suspected of duplicity. "Compose yourself, Miss Bellamy, and tell me first, do you still maintain upon reflection that the sentence pronounced was 7 months?" "I shall maintain it until my dying day," she said, with a firmness that did her credit. "I did not merely hear it, Mr. Holmes. I felt it, as one feels a weight lifted from the chest. I had feared years. I had prepared myself, so far as any sister can prepare herself, for years, and when Sir Reginald said months, I very nearly fainted with relief, so that Mr. Lorimer had to take my arm. You are quite certain there could be no confusion between the two words, spoken as they might be in a crowded courtroom, at some distance from the bench?" I was in the second row, sir, not 10 feet from where he stood. I do not think I could mistake the two words, spoken so, any more than I could mistake summer for winter. She paused, and something in her expression changed, grew inward and uncertain, as though she were reaching after a memory only half formed. There is one thing more, Mr. Holmes, which I had not thought worth mentioning until now, for I could make nothing of it. As the sentence was given, a man seated directly behind me, I could not see his face, for I didn't turn, leaned forward and whispered, very low, "That will not do." I thought at the time he referred to some point of law, some technicality of no interest to myself. I have wondered since whether it meant a great deal more. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow at this, though he asked no immediate question upon the point, turning instead to matters of the transfer itself, by whose order it had been made, at what hour, under what authority. Miss Bellamy could furnish few particulars beyond her own alarm, and it was arranged that Holmes should call that same afternoon upon Inspector Bradstreet, whose department had signed the transfer papers. We found the inspector at the yard in a mood of settled and not unfriendly scepticism. Bradstreet was an honest officer, methodical rather than brilliant, who had crossed paths with Holmes on more than one previous occasion, and had learned, if not always to welcome his interference, at least to respect the results it commonly produced. "I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes, I can make nothing of this business but a family clutching at any straw to lighten a hard sentence," said he, leaning back in his chair with the air of a man well satisfied with the simplicity of his own conclusions. "The record is clear. The clerk is a man of 30 years' unblemished service, and Bellamy was convicted fair and square upon evidence that left no reasonable doubt. As for the transfer, it was done upon the usual recommendation of the prison authorities, who found the local jail overcrowded. There is nothing sinister in it." "You have examined the record yourself?" "I have seen it. Aye, and a more orderly document you will not find in any court office in London. 7 years it says, and 7 years it will remain, unless someone can show me better cause than a solicitor's fond memory and a sister's tears." He said this not unkindly, but with the settled patience of a man who has heard such protests before, and found them, upon every previous occasion, to dissolve beneath examination. Holmes thanked him with courtesy, and we withdrew, but I could see that the inspector's certainty had, if anything, sharpened rather than dulled my friend's interest. "A convenient theory, Watson," he remarked as we walked away, "and convenient theories are the very ones I have learned most to distrust. Bradstreet is no fool, but he has not looked at the document with the eye of a man who suspects it. Let us look at it again ourselves, with rather more particularity than courtesy permitted upon our first visit." We returned that same afternoon to the court office, where Holmes, presenting Lorimer's card of introduction, obtained leave to examine the record book itself, the ponderous ledger in which each day's judgments were entered in sequence. He turned the heavy pages until he found the entry in question, and I watched him bend low over it, his lens once more in hand, tracing the single word, years, with a care that seemed to me almost reverent. "You will observe, Watson," he said at last, in a voice pitched low enough that the clerks at their distant desks should not overhear, "that this word is written in a hand very slightly firmer than the words surrounding it. The pen pressed a shade more heavily, the downstrokes a fraction bolder. It is a difference no jury would remark, and scarcely one a handwriting expert would swear to without long study, but it is there." We were joined at this moment by Weatherby himself, the clerk, a stooped and grey little man with ink permanently blackening the second finger of his right hand, who greeted us with the nervous courtesy of a man unaccustomed to having his life's work called into question. He admitted readily enough when Holmes questioned him that he had been unwell on the evening following Bellamy's trial, a feverish chill, he said, that had kept him from his usual thoroughness, and that he had permitted an assistant to complete some portion of the copying while he rested in the outer office. "Which assistant?" Holmes asked. Weatherby hesitated as a man hesitates who fears to cast blame unjustly. "I could not now say with certainty, sir. Several young men passed through this office on the business of the various firms. I recall only that I was grateful for the help and thought no more of it. It was, I confess, a small and unpromising admission, yet I saw Holmes receive it as a man receives a coin he suspects to be of far greater value than its face would suggest, turning it over and over in the privacy of his own thoughts, as we made our way homeward through streets already beginning once more to gather their evening fog about the lamps. Chapter 4. The Overlooked Sandshaker. The court stood empty when we returned to it the following morning, the great oak doors unlocked for us by a caretaker who plainly regarded our purpose with more curiosity than comprehension. There is something singularly desolate about a courtroom vacated of its business, the tiers of empty benches, the dock standing bare and expectant, the whole apparatus of justice reduced, in the absence of prisoner and judge and jury, to so much dark and silent furniture. Holmes moved through it, as a man moves through a house he means to purchase, pausing here to examine a panel, there to measure a distance with his eye, and I confess I found myself, not for the first time, entirely unable to guess what he sought. He spent the better part of an hour about the clerk's station alone, a low desk set somewhat apart from the bench, cluttered with the ordinary implements of that trade, pens, an inkstand, bundles of tied papers, and a small brass shaker such as clerks the country over employ, for casting fine sand upon wet ink, that it may dry the more quickly and resist the smudging of a careless hand. This last object drew his particular attention. He unscrewed its perforated cap, tilted a portion of the contents into his palm, and studied it beneath his lens with an intentness I had seen him bestow on other occasions, upon nothing humbler than a fragment of cigar ash or a smear of clay. "Come and look at this, Watson," said he, and I bent to examine what lay in his hand. To my unpractised eye it appeared merely sand, of the ordinary yellowish-white variety, but scattered among the finer grains I could make out a scattering of others, distinctly blue-grey in colour, coarser than their fellows. "You will not find that colour in any court supply in London," Holmes said. "Ordinary blotting sand is calcined and bleached to a uniform pale hue. This blue-grey variety is characteristic of a particular manufacturer whose product is favoured chiefly by private stationers of some pretension, the sort of establishment that supplies writing desks for gentlemen's private studies, not the utilitarian offices of the courts." He returned the sand carefully to a small paper twist, which he stowed within his pocket-book. "Someone has used this shaker upon a document that was never written at this desk, Watson, or else has brought his own materials into this room and left a trace of them behind, thinking no one would trouble to examine so humble an object as a box of drying sand." I own that I found it difficult even then to see how so trifling a discovery could bear upon the question of Bellamy's sentence, but I had learned long since that Holmes's investigations proceeded less by leaps than by the patient accretion of such fragments, each individually insignificant, until their sum produced a conclusion no single fact could have suggested. It was as we were preparing to leave that Holmes's attention was caught by a faded notice pinned to the panelling near the clerk's station, some outdated schedule of sittings curling at its corners with age. He lifted one corner of it and revealed, beneath, a pale scratch upon the dark wood, shallow, but unmistakably deliberate, as though some sharp implement had been drawn across the panel, and the notice pinned afterward to conceal the mark. He examined this for some moments in silence, then replaced the notice exactly as he had found it, without offering any remark upon its significance, and I did not press him, knowing from long experience that such reticence generally preceded some more complete explanation at a later hour. We were joined shortly afterward by Weatherby, summoned by message to attend upon us, who arrived looking considerably more careworn than upon our previous meeting. Holmes questioned him closely regarding the evening of the trial, and the clerk's account, given now for the second time, showed a curious inconsistency he had not previously mentioned. "I recall being taken with a coughing fit not long after the court rose," said Weatherby, pressing a hand to his chest as though the memory itself brought on some sympathetic discomfort, and in reaching for my handkerchief I upset a small stack of correspondence upon my desk, which cost me some minutes to set right. It was shortly after this that I began to feel the fever coming upon me in earnest, and I confess the remainder of that evening is not entirely clear in my recollection. You sealed the completed record yourself before you left the office. I did, sir, with the court's own wax, as is always our custom. You're quite certain it was the court's wax? A dark brownish red, is it not? Rather duller than the wax commonly used for private correspondence. Weatherby hesitated, and I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty pass across his tired features. I had believed so, sir, though now that you press me upon the point I could not swear to its precise shade. I was far from well that evening, Mr. Holmes, and I own that my memory of small particulars is not what it was. It was a small admission, yet one that seemed to settle, in Bradstreet's mind at least, the whole weight of suspicion upon the unfortunate clerk. The inspector, informed of these details that same afternoon, professed himself satisfied that the case had very nearly solved itself. A sick man, half out of his senses, careless with his wax and his sand alike. There is your falsified record, Mr. Holmes, and no more sinister than that. He ought to be relieved of his post, but I see no cause to summon a magistrate over it. Holmes said nothing to contradict him at the time, though as we walked away from the yard he permitted himself an observation that has remained with me ever since as one of the truest things I ever heard him say upon the subject of criminal investigation. You will notice, Watson, a curious feature of guilty men, which the innocent very rarely share. They explain too much. Weatherby has now offered us a coughing fit, a fever, a disordered desk, and an uncertain memory of his own sealing wax, each new detail volunteered before I had properly asked for it. A man who has genuinely forgotten does not commonly remember upon reflection quite so many separate and convenient reasons for his forgetting. It is the confused man, not the false one, who commonly insists he remembers everything perfectly and grows angry when he is doubted. It is the false witness, or the frightened one, who begins, unprompted, to construct an edifice of excuse. You believe Weatherby is lying, then? I believe, said Holmes, drawing his coat collar higher against the sharpening wind, that Weatherby is frightened, which is a different thing entirely, and very often a more interesting one. A guilty man lies to protect himself. A frightened man very often lies to protect someone else, without in the least understanding why he does so, or at whose true bidding. He fell silent then, and did not speak again until we had reached our own door, where he paused upon the step and added, as though the thought had only that moment completed itself within him, "There is a hand behind Weatherby's confusion, Watson, and it is not his own. I begin to have some notion of whose hand it may be, but notions are cheap, and I should be a poor detective indeed if I mistook a notion for a proof." Chapter 5. The Man with Two Names. It has often seemed to me, in reflecting upon the singular methods of my friend, that his investigations resembled nothing so much as the unpicking of an old and complicated piece of embroidery, wherein the true pattern lies concealed beneath threads of an entirely different colour, and cannot be discovered save by patient tracing of each strand to its origin. So it proved in the matter of James Bellamy, whose history, once Holmes had determined to examine it, unfolded a far stranger tapestry than either of us had anticipated when Lorimer first sat trembling in our sitting-room. "We have looked, Watson, at the record, and at those who wrote it," Holmes said to me on the Friday morning, over a breakfast he had scarcely touched. "It is time we looked also at the man whose fate hangs upon that single altered word. A prisoner is rarely so entirely without significance to the world as his jailers suppose. To this end we spent the better part of 2 days in an occupation that would have struck an observer as tedious beyond description, but which Holmes pursued with an appetite undimmed by hour after hour, among dusty ledgers and old employment records. Bellamy, it transpired, had served for some 3 years as a copying clerk in the offices of a shipping concern before removing to the firm where his embezzlement had occurred, and it was in this earlier position that Holmes's inquiries yielded their first fruit. "Here, Watson," said he, on the second afternoon, tapping a faded ledger with one long finger, "is a curious matter. This shipping firm was some 8 years since embroiled in a scandal concerning forged bills of lading, a business that ruined 2 lesser partners and drove a third from the country under a cloud never fully dispersed. The man chiefly suspected, though never brought to trial for want of sufficient evidence, was one Arthur Selden, a name that recurs with some frequency in these old papers, always in connection with documents that were afterward found to be other than they appeared. You believe there is some connection between this old scandal and Bellamy's present misfortune. I believe it is at the least a thread worth following, and threads that come to hand in the midst of a fog are not to be despised, however slender." He closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "Consider, Watson, the singular precision of the alteration we have been investigating. Not 5 years added to Bellamy's sentence, nor 10, but 6 years and 5 months precisely. The difference, one might almost say, between a punishment a man might survive with his usefulness intact, and one calculated to remove him from the world of active affairs for so long that whatever he knew, or threatened to reveal, should have lost all power to trouble anyone by the time he emerged. A short sentence returns a man to society, while his knowledge is still fresh, and his motive for using it undimmed. A long one buries both the man and what he knows. It was upon this same afternoon that we called once more upon Ambrose Pike, ostensibly to return certain papers Lorimer had lent us, though I understood well enough that Holmes's true purpose lay elsewhere. We found the young assistant at his desk in the outer office, engaged upon some copying, and he rose to greet us with his customary mild civility. "I wonder," said Holmes in a tone of the most idle curiosity, as though the question had only that moment occurred to him, "whether you have ever, in the course of your duties here, come across the name of Arthur Selden?" I watched Pike's face with some attention, but could detect nothing beyond a faint and reasonable puzzlement. "Selden," he repeated. "I cannot say the name is familiar to me, Mr. Holmes. Should it be?" "Perhaps not. It concerns an old matter, long since closed." Holmes turned as though to examine a shelf of bound volumes, and it was in this seemingly careless posture, his back half turned to the room, that he asked, "The initials, at least. A.S. Do those recall anything to you?" "I confess they do not. Beyond that they are Mr. Selden's own, as you have just told me," Pike replied, and it was not until we had left the chambers and were once more in the street that Holmes remarked upon the answer with an expression I had rarely seen upon his countenance, a kind of grim and quiet satisfaction, such as a chess player might show upon seeing an opponent commit at last the single error for which he had patiently waited through a dozen cautious moves. "You will observe, Watson, that I named the full surname Selden in my first question, and it was only afterward, in my second, that I mentioned the initials alone, without repeating the name. Yet Pike spoke of the initials as Mr. Selden's own, a connection he could only have made if he already possessed, in his own mind, some fuller knowledge of the name than he had admitted to possessing." "He might have simply assumed you referred to the same man," I objected, though without great conviction. "He might," Holmes conceded, "and a barrister defending him would make precisely that argument, and make it well. It is not proof, Watson. It is a thread, no more. But it is a thread that runs, I think, very close to the centre of this small dark garment we are unpicking." We called that same evening upon Miss Bellamy, at Lorimer's suggestion, to inquire whether her brother had ever, in his letters from prison, made mention of any acquaintance from his earlier employment. She considered the question with the careful gravity of a woman determined to be of use, and at length produced from her reticule a letter, worn soft with frequent reading and refolding. "There is this," said she, "which I could make nothing of at the time, and set down to the low spirits natural to his situation." She read aloud a passage in which her brother had written, somewhat cryptically, "of a gentleman here who is not what he signs himself, though I dare not say more in a letter that may be read by other eyes than yours." She had believed it, she confessed, the fancy of a frightened man seeking some drama to relieve the monotony of his confinement, and had not thought to mention it before. That night, walking back through streets grown quiet with the lateness of the hour, Holmes was silent for so long that I ventured at last to ask what occupied his thoughts. "I am reconstructing, Watson, the journey of a single sheet of paper," said he, "from the judge's mouth to the clerk's pen, from the clerk's pen to the copying desk, from the copying desk to the wax and the seal, from the seal to the messenger who carried it to Lorimer's office. At every one of these stages a dozen honest men might have made a dozen honest errors, and none of them would have produced the precise and calculated falsehood we have discovered. I begin to believe, therefore, that the falsification did not occur at any of these stages at all. I believe the record that Weatherby sealed that evening said months, exactly as Lorimer and Miss Bellamy both maintain, and that somewhere between the sealing and the delivery, an entirely different document, prepared in advance and waiting for its moment, was substituted in its place. "But that would require," I began, and stopped, for the implication seemed to me even then almost too audacious to credit. "It would require," Holmes finished for me, "a man patient enough to have prepared a false record before he could possibly have known its exact wording would be needed, bold enough to substitute it beneath the very noses of a court office, and above all a man so entirely unremarkable in his person and his manner that no one present that evening would afterward recall having noticed him at all." He paused beneath a lamp-post, and I saw, in its pale light, an expression upon his face that I had learned, over the years, to associate with the very near approach of a solution. "I think, Watson, that we have already met such a man and shaken his hand, and thought no more of him than we should think of the furniture in his own office." Chapter 6. A Visit to the Club. Sir Reginald Vale dined, we had learned, on Tuesday evenings at the Athenian, a club of severe and ancient dignity in Pall Mall, much favoured by the higher ranks of the judiciary and the more sedate variety of Queen's Counsel. Holmes had secured, through some acquaintance whose name he did not trouble to divulge, an invitation for us both, and it was in that hushed and leather-scented dining-room, beneath portraits of judges long since gathered to their fathers, that we were at last presented to the man whose single spoken word lay at the root of all our difficulties. Sir Reginald proved a tall, spare gentleman of some 60 years, with a countenance that might have been carved from the same grey stone as the courts he had served for 3 decades, and a manner so entirely without superfluous warmth that I understood at once how he had earned his reputation for severity upon the bench. Yet there was nothing cruel in his bearing. Rather, it seemed to me the sternness of a man who had made precision itself into a species of morality, and who regarded any departure from exactness, whether in law or in conversation, as a species of minor sin. "Mr. Holmes," said he, when we had been seated and the preliminary courtesies exchanged, "I am told you concern yourself with the Bellamy matter. I will tell you plainly that I intended a sentence of 7 months, believing the young man weak rather than wicked, a fool led astray by petty debts rather than a hardened criminal deserving of the full severity the law allows. That the written record now states 7 years is a matter that has troubled my sleep more than I care to admit. You are quite certain of your own words, Sir Reginald. I have passed sentence upon some thousands of men in the course of my career, Mr. Holmes, and I do not confuse the gravity of my own pronouncements. I said 7 months. I have said as much privately to Lorimer, though I have been reluctant to say it publicly, for reasons I think you will readily appreciate. Your reluctance concerns the standing of your court. It concerns justice itself, sir, which depends upon public confidence quite as much as upon private accuracy. If I now declare that my own court's record cannot be trusted, what becomes of every sentence I have passed these 30 years? Attorneys will comb through old convictions seeking similar irregularities. Appeals will multiply. The whole edifice of settled judgment, upon which men's liberty and society's order alike depend, will be called into question upon the strength of one uncertain word. He set down his glass with the precise, controlled movement of a man accustomed to weighing every gesture. I want the truth discovered, Mr. Holmes, more urgently than you may suppose, but I want it discovered quietly, and I want it proven beyond any reasonable dispute before I stake my own credibility upon overturning a sealed record. It was, I confess, an argument I found difficult to fault, however much my sympathies lay with young Bellamy languishing at that moment upon the Devon moors. Holmes questioned the judge closely upon the circumstances of the sentencing itself, the hour of day, the state of the courtroom, whether any unusual persons had been present, but Sir Reginald's recollections, precise as they were regarding his own words, could furnish little upon the wider scene, a judge upon the bench having, as he himself observed with a dry and joyless humour, very little leisure to study his audience while pronouncing sentence upon a man's liberty. It was as we rose from the table, our business with Sir Reginald concluded, that I observed, across the crowded dining-room, a sight that gave me some little start of surprise. Ambrose Pike stood near the entrance to the smoking-room, engaged in conversation with an elderly gentleman of markedly legal appearance, their heads bent close in the manner of men discussing some matter they did not wish overheard. "Holmes," I murmured, "there is Pike." My friend's eyes followed my glance, and I saw them narrow with an interest he took no particular pains to conceal. "So it is. And the gentleman with whom he speaks so earnestly is, unless I am much mistaken, old Mr. Culverwell, who defended more than one doubtful client in the Chancery Court some years since, and who is generally believed, in certain circles, to have defended Arthur Selden himself when that gentleman's affairs first came under suspicion." We had no opportunity to approach unobserved before Pike, glancing up, caught sight of us and came forward at once, his manner as easy and unruffled as ever. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I had not looked to find you dining at the Athenian." He gestured with every appearance of casual candour toward his companion. "Allow me to present Mr. Culverwell, an old friend of my late father's, whom I encounter here from time to time quite by chance." Culverwell, a stooped and courtly old gentleman with the yellowed, watchful eyes of one who has spent a lifetime among the small deceits of chancery practice, bowed with old-fashioned punctilio and professed himself delighted, murmuring something to the effect that young Pike was a promising fellow of whom his father would have been justly proud. There was nothing in the exchange that any reasonable observer could have called suspicious, and yet I felt, watching Holmes's face, that he marked something in the encounter which escaped my own less practised perception. We did not linger, and it was not until we had regained the pavement of Pall Mall, the club's lighted windows receding behind us into the evening murk, that Holmes gave voice to his thoughts. "You are eager, I think, Watson, to declare Mr. Pike our man upon the strength of that meeting alone," said he, with a faint smile that robbed the observation of any sting. "I would counsel patience. A coincidence of acquaintance is not a proof of conspiracy, and old Culverwell may indeed be nothing more than a friend of Pike's late father, exactly as he claims. I have known chance to produce stranger juxtapositions than this, and a detective who leaps at every convenient appearance of guilt will find himself, sooner or later, hanging an innocent man to satisfy the tidiness of his own theory. And yet you do not dismiss it." "I do not dismiss anything, Watson, until I have exhausted its possibilities of meaning, nor do I accept anything until I have done the same. Let us consider what we now possess rather than what we suspect. We have a clerk, Weatherby, 30 years honest, suddenly vague upon points he ought to remember with perfect clarity, and offering excuses with a fluency more suited to a drafted statement than a fevered recollection. We have a judge, precise to the point of severity, whose private certainty cannot yet be made to serve as public proof. We have an assistant, Pike, colourless to the point of invisibility, whose single slip of the tongue regarding certain initials I have not forgotten, and who now proves acquainted, however innocently, with a lawyer once connected to a name from Bellamy's own past. Each of these persons, Watson, might act from a different motive entirely. Weatherby from fear of disgrace, the judge from concern for his court's good name, Pike from some deeper and darker reason we have not yet uncovered. How are we to distinguish between them?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again it was in that low, reflective tone he reserved for the rare occasions upon which he permitted me some glimpse of his method's inner workings, rather than merely its triumphant conclusions. The case turns, I begin to believe, upon a contradiction of habit rather than upon any single fact we have yet gathered. One man among our suspects writes as a clerk, writes, carefully, correctly, and without originality. One man speaks as a lawyer speaks, precisely, and with an instinct for the exact weight of every word. And one man, Watson, remembers as a criminal remembers, too readily, too completely, and with a fluency that betrays rehearsal rather than recollection. When I have determined which of our gentlemen exhibits that third and most telling habit, I think we shall have found not merely who altered a single word upon a single page, but why the alteration was made so precise, and so cruel, and so very nearly successful. He said no more upon the subject that night, but I observed, as we walked homeward through the gathering dark, that his stick tapped the pavement with a briskness I had not seen in him for some days, the unmistakable outward sign of a mind drawing rapidly, and with evident satisfaction, toward its mark. Chapter 7. The Clerk Confesses. The development that so nearly closed our investigation, and closed it, I may say, in a manner directly opposed to the truth, came upon us with the suddenness of a summer storm. We had scarcely finished breakfast on the Saturday morning when a message arrived from Inspector Bradstreet, requesting Holmes's presence at the yard upon a matter he described, with evident satisfaction, as the settlement of the Bellamy business once and for all. We found the inspector in high good humour, a mood so foreign to his customary caution that I remarked upon it as we were shown into his office. "Weatherby has confessed, Mr. Holmes," said he, before we had properly taken our seats. "Walked into this very office yesterday evening of his own accord, after having been absent from his duties the better part of the afternoon, and gave a full statement. He does not claim deliberate falsification, mind you, only negligence, a clerical blunder committed while feverish and confused. But a confession is a confession, and I think we may now consider the matter closed." He passed across a written statement, several pages in length, and I read it with an interest sharpened by all we had learned in the preceding days. It described, in careful and somewhat elaborate language, how Weatherby had been overcome by illness on the evening of Bellamy's trial, how his hand had trembled as he wrote, how in his confusion he had set down years where he had intended and truly believed the judge to have pronounced months. The document concluded with an expression of the clerk's profound regret, and a phrase that struck me, even upon first reading, as curiously formal for so simple and human an admission. He had acted, the statement declared, without malicious intent and entirely under the pressure of official fatigue and physical infirmity. Holmes read the confession through twice, his countenance betraying nothing, and when he had finished he asked a single question that seemed, at the time, almost beside the point. "You have spoken with Weatherby yourself, Inspector, face to face, and at some length." "I have, and a more broken down, sorry figure of a man you would not wish to see. He wept, Mr. Holmes, actually wept when he signed the statement, and begged only that the matter be handled with as little publicity as the circumstances allow, for the sake of his family." "And this statement, did he write it himself in your presence, or did he bring it already prepared?" Bradstreet's satisfaction dimmed a shade at the question. "He brought it prepared, as it happens, saying he had spent the previous hours composing it at his lodgings, that he might set the matter down accurately, without the confusion of an examination. It seemed to me a reasonable enough precaution in a man anxious to tell the truth without further error." "Reasonable, certainly," Holmes agreed, in a tone that gave away nothing of what lay behind the word, and returned the statement to the inspector's desk with a courtesy that left Bradstreet, I think, entirely satisfied that Holmes shared his own conclusion. It was not until we had left the yard that my friend permitted himself any comment upon the document we had just examined. "You noticed nothing curious in the language of that confession, Watson?" "It seemed to me a very complete and orderly account," I admitted, though I confess I thought it rather more formal than I should have expected from a frightened man writing in the privacy of his own lodgings. More than formal, Watson. Drafted. Consider the phrases, without malicious intent. Under the pressure of official fatigue. These are not the words of a broken clerk composing a hasty confession through tears. They are the words of a man accustomed to the careful hedging of legal language, chosen with an eye to their effect upon a reader who must be persuaded that carelessness, and carelessness alone, lies at the root of the matter. A truly guilty man, confessing from genuine remorse, writes in shorter sentences and plainer words. A man reciting a confession composed for him by another writes exactly as Weatherby has written here. You believe someone else composed that statement? I believe it exceedingly probable. And there is a second matter, Watson, which I have not yet mentioned to the inspector, for I wished first to be certain of it myself. He drew from his pocket-book the small paper twist of blue-grey sand he had gathered from the courtroom shaker some days before, and held it up between us as we walked. Weatherby's statement declares that he dried the false entry, in his confusion, using the court's own sand shaker, precisely as he would have done upon any ordinary occasion. Yet we have established that this shaker contains grains of a private and rather superior manufacture, of a sort no court office would supply, and certainly none that a fevered and hurried clerk would have thought to bring from his own home in the midst of illness, if Weatherby's confession is to be believed in every particular, that sand ought never to have found its way into a court sand shaker at all, unless someone else, at some earlier time, had already substituted his own materials for the court's ordinary supply, and left them there in readiness. I confess the implication struck me with some force, though I was slower than Holmes, as I generally was, to trace it to its furthest conclusion. You believe, then, that the true author of the falsification prepared his materials in advance, brought his own sand and perhaps his own wax, and used the court's own desk to lend his substitution the appearance of an ordinary entry? I believe it is the only theory that accounts for every fact we have gathered, Watson, though I do not yet possess the single piece of evidence that would place the theory beyond dispute. He fell silent for the length of a street, and when he spoke again there was in his voice a note I had heard before, upon the eve of some difficult conclusion, half triumph and half a kind of weary sadness at the human folly the truth was about to expose. Weatherby is not our criminal, Watson. He is a frightened and honest man persuaded by someone he trusted that his own genuine illness and confusion offer a convenient shelter from a storm he does not fully understand. He has been made to believe himself guilty of negligence, that he may confess to it and thereby close, forever, any inquiry into the true and far more deliberate crime that lies beneath. But who could so persuade him, and to what end? Surely no honest man confesses to a fault he has not committed merely upon another's suggestion. No honest man does so without cause, Holmes agreed. But a frightened man, told by someone in a position of apparent authority or friendship, that his career, his pension, and his family's respectability all depend upon, accepting a lesser blame rather than risking exposure to a graver and unproven suspicion, may be persuaded to a great deal that a calmer examination would never have extracted from him. I think, Watson, we must discover who visited Weatherby during his hours of absence yesterday afternoon, before he arrived at the yard with his statement already so carefully composed. We returned that same evening to make what inquiries we could of Weatherby's neighbours and of the porter at his lodging-house. But darkness had fallen, and the fog once more thickened about the gas lamps before we had gathered more than the barest particulars. That a visitor had indeed called upon the clerk during the afternoon in question, a gentleman the porter could describe only as quiet-spoken, and not remarkable to look at, sir, such as you'd pass in the street and never think twice upon. It was, I reflected, as we made our way home through the yellow gloom, a description that might have fitted 100,000 men in London. And yet I saw, in the set of Holmes's jaw, as he walked beside me in silence, that he believed it fitted one man only, and that the net, however slowly, was drawing close about him at last. Chapter 8. Watson is nearly convinced. I will confess, in the interests of that honesty which I have always endeavoured to preserve in setting down these narratives, that by the Sunday morning following Weatherby's confession, I had very nearly persuaded myself that Holmes pursued a theory more ingenious than sound. The confession lay signed and witnessed at the Yard. Bradstreet was satisfied. The newspapers, which had got wind of the affair by some channel I never fully traced, were already preparing paragraphs upon the sad spectacle of a faithful servant of the court undone by illness and overwork. It seemed to me, turning the matter over as I smoked my morning pipe, that the simplest explanation was very often the true one, and that Holmes's insistence upon a hidden hand behind Weatherby's confusion smacked, though I should never have said so aloud, of a detective reluctant to abandon a more dramatic theory for a duller and more probable truth. I ventured at length to say something of this to Holmes himself, who had been sitting for the better part of an hour in that attitude of motionless concentration which I had learned never to interrupt without good cause, his eyes fixed upon the middle distance and his pipe gone cold between his fingers. "You think me perverse, Watson," said he without turning his head, in a tone that held more amusement than offence, "in refusing to accept a confession that satisfies everyone but myself. I think only that a signed confession freely given is generally stronger evidence than a grain of coloured sand," I replied, "and I own I do not fully understand what more you require before you will accept it." "What I require," said Holmes, rousing himself and knocking out his pipe against the grate, "is an explanation that accounts for every fact, Watson, and not merely for the convenient ones. Weatherby's confession explains the altered word. It does not explain why that word was altered by precisely 6 years and 5 months. Rather than by some round and careless number such as a fevered clerk might blunder into. It does not explain the raised blot upon the certified copy, which speaks of a second drying, nor the blue-grey sand that has no business in a court office, nor the dark brown wax that is not the court's usual seal. A confession that accounts for one fact while leaving 4 others unexplained is not a solution, Watson. It is a curtain drawn hastily across a stage where the true drama has not yet concluded. It was, I own, a fair rebuke, though I felt the sting of it less for the argument's force than for the evident justice underlying it. Holmes crossed to the window, where a thin and watery sunlight had at last begun to disperse the fog that had hung over London for the better part of the week, and stood some moments in silent thought, before turning back to me with a decisiveness that told me his mind was made up upon some course of action. "There is one measurement I have not yet taken, Watson, and I mean to take it this morning, before the light fail again, or some further confession muddies the water past all clearing." He would say no more, but summoned a cab, and within the half-hour we stood once more within the empty courtroom. Holmes bent low over the record-book with his lens, measuring with a small ivory rule the exact spacing of the letters composing the fatal word. "Observe," said he at length, calling me to his side, "the word years occupies upon this page a space very slightly wider than the word itself strictly requires, as though the pen had been guided to fill a gap already allowed for it, rather than writing freely to whatever length the word demanded. Compare it, if you will, with this earlier entry upon the same page, where the clerk has written 18 months in his ordinary hand. You will see that there the spacing follows the words exactly, with no such deliberate allowance." He straightened, and I saw in his eyes that particular light, which told me some final piece of the puzzle had fallen, at last, into its ordained place. The record was not altered after it was written, Watson. It was written from the beginning with a space prepared for a longer word than the truth required, which means the falsification did not occur at the moment of entry at all, but was planned before the ink was ever set to paper. This discovery, momentous as it seemed to me, was to be followed within the hour by one yet more startling, Holmes proposed that we call upon Pike at his lodgings, a modest set of rooms in a quiet street off Gray's Inn Road, and finding upon inquiry of the landlady that the young man was absent upon some errand until the evening, Holmes requested, and by means of an authority I suspected owed more to his manner than to any legal right, obtained permission to await his return within the rooms themselves. I confess I felt some discomfort at this proceeding, which savoured to my conventional mind of an intrusion scarcely more justified than the crime we sought to expose. Holmes, however, moved through the small sitting-room with the swift, methodical thoroughness of a man who regarded such scruples as luxuries he could not presently afford. He found little, at first, beyond the ordinary effects of a bachelor of modest means, a shelf of legal volumes, a writing desk neatly kept, a few framed prints of no particular distinction. It was the writing desk that yielded at last the harvest he sought. Upon its surface stood a small dish of drying sand, blue-grey in colour, identical in every particular to that which Holmes had gathered from the court's own shaker, and beside it a stick of sealing wax of a dark, dull brown, quite unlike the bright vermilion commonly used for private correspondence. And in a drawer, imperfectly closed, Holmes discovered a small packet of old visiting cards, yellowed with age, bearing upon each the engraved name, Mr. A. Selden. "There, Watson," said he very quietly, holding one of the cards to the light. "There is our second name at last, kept, I imagine, from some sentiment its owner has not been able entirely to master. A last relic of a life he believed safely buried and dared not destroy." We had scarcely returned these articles to their places, and withdrawn from the rooms with what discretion the circumstances allowed, when we encountered Pike himself upon the stair, returning earlier than the landlady had led us to expect. If he felt any alarm at finding us there, he betrayed none of it. His greeting was as easy, as mild, and as entirely unremarkable as it had been at our every previous meeting, and he pressed us, with every appearance of genuine goodwill, to allow him to procure a cab to carry us back to Baker Street, through streets grown treacherous with the returning dusk. It was during this short journey, as the cab rattled through the darkening squares, that Holmes remarked, with the studied carelessness of a man discussing the weather, "It is a curious thing, Mr. Pike, how a sentence of 7 months might have served Bellamy so much better than one of 7 years." "It would have ruined everything," Pike replied at once, and I saw, even in the dimness of the cab, a stillness come over his features the instant the words had left him. The stillness of a man who has heard his own voice speak a truth his mind had not sanctioned. He recovered himself with commendable swiftness, adding something about the ruin of a young man's prospects and the cruelty of a long sentence upon so slight a fault. But the moment had passed, and I saw Holmes's eyes meet my own across the narrow space of the carriage with a significance I could not mistake. Neither of us spoke of it again that evening, but when we had at last regained our own fireside, and Pike's cab had rattled away into the fog, Holmes sat long in silence before remarking, in a voice from which all lightness had departed, "No innocent assistant, Watson, however helpful, however diligent, could know what everything meant in that sentence, unless it was his own everything he spoke of. I think we are very near the end of this business now, and I think, when the end comes, it will prove a sadder and stranger story than any of us, saving perhaps Bellamy himself, has yet imagined." Chapter 9. Holmes dismantles the record. Holmes spent the better part of Monday in a silence I had learned not to disturb, and it was not until the evening of that day that he informed me, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has at last completed some intricate calculation, that he had asked Lorimer to gather every person concerned in the matter at his chambers the following afternoon. "I have told him only that I believe I can now explain the falsification to everyone's satisfaction," said Holmes, drawing on his coat, "which is true, though perhaps not in the sense he will expect. Weatherby will be there, and Bradstreet, and Sir Reginald has consented to attend, though with evident reluctance. Miss Bellamy will come, and Mr. Pike, of course, whose presence I consider rather more necessary than his own modesty would suggest." We arrived the following afternoon to find the solicitor's chambers arranged almost as for a formal hearing, chairs set in a loose half-circle before the great desk, and I confess the assembled company presented a curious study in contrasted anxieties. Weatherby pale and trembling, his hands never still upon his knees. Sir Reginald erect and grave, plainly resolved to bear whatever revelation might come with the same composure he had brought to 30 years upon the bench. Bradstreet frankly sceptical, his notebook open upon his lap as though he expected, even now, to record nothing more than the confirmation of Weatherby's confession, and Miss Bellamy, white-faced but steady, her hand resting upon Lorimer's arm. Pike alone appeared entirely at his ease, seated a little apart with the deferential stillness of a man who considers himself quite properly no more than a spectator to matters concerning his betters. Holmes stood before the cold hearth, and began, as was his custom upon such occasions, not with his conclusion but with the patient reconstruction of the path that had led him to it. "I was consulted a fortnight since," said he, "upon a question that seemed, at first, of the simplest kind, whether a word upon a page had been honestly written, or dishonestly altered. I have since come to believe that the true question was never so simple, and that the answer touches a matter far older and far darker than any of us supposed when this inquiry began." He turned first to Weatherby, and his tone, though it lost nothing of its precision, gentle perceptibly. "Mr. Weatherby, I must tell you plainly that I do not believe your confession, though I believe absolutely in your honesty. You did not falsify that record. You wrote, upon the evening in question, exactly what Sir Reginald pronounced, the word months, set down correctly, sealed correctly, and dispatched in perfect good faith." Weatherby stared at him as a drowning man might stare at an unlooked-for spar. "Then how, Mr. Holmes? I confess to the very act." "You confess to an act you did not commit, because you were persuaded by someone in whom you placed a natural and reasonable trust that your own genuine illness that evening offered a safer harbour than the truth. You were told, I believe, that suspicion had already fallen upon you regardless of your innocence, and that a confession of mere negligence would spare you the far graver charge of deliberate corruption that some enemy, real or invented, meant to bring against you. It was a cruel deception, sir, but not, I think, one that should weigh upon your conscience one moment longer." "Who?" Weatherby began, but Holmes had already turned from him, and the clerk's question died unfinished upon his lips, as every eye in the room followed the direction of my friend's gaze. "The falsification, Sir Reginald," Holmes continued, addressing the judge, though his words were plainly meant for the whole company, "did not occur after your sentence was recorded. It occurred before it, in the preparation, days or weeks in advance, of a false document already written, already sealed with a private wax, already dried with a private sand, and waiting only for the moment of confusion following any court sitting, to be substituted for the genuine record. The true record, honestly written by Mr. Weatherby, was quietly removed. The false one, prepared in advance to state 7 years, regardless of what sentence might actually be pronounced, was put in its place." "Prepared in advance?" Bradstreet interjected, his scepticism giving way, I saw, to a reluctant and dawning attention. "But how could any man prepare a false record before he knew what the true sentence would be? He could not know the sentence, Inspector, but he did not need to. He needed only to ensure that whatever sentence Sir Reginald pronounced, the written record should state a term severe enough to remove James Bellamy from the world of active men for the better part of a decade. A short sentence would have returned Bellamy to society, while his knowledge, for Bellamy possessed knowledge, gentlemen, that someone in this room could not afford to have made public, was still fresh, and his motive for revealing it still urgent. A sentence of 7 years would bury that knowledge, and its possessor, so deeply that by the time of his release it should have lost all power to wound." He paused, and in the silence that followed I heard Miss Bellamy draw a sharp, unsteady breath. "Some 8 years ago," Holmes went on, A shipping firm in the city was troubled by a scandal of forged bills of lading in which one Arthur Selden was chiefly suspected, though never brought to trial. Selden vanished from that world entirely, or seemed to. James Bellamy, then a junior clerk in that same firm, came in time to suspect the true identity of a certain mild and helpful gentleman who had since reinvented himself under a different name and a different profession, and who lived in perpetual dread that Bellamy might, at some unguarded moment, speak that suspicion aloud. Every eye in the room now turned, as one, toward Ambrose Pike, who sat very still, his hands folded quietly in his lap, his countenance betraying nothing beyond a faint and courteous interest, as though the conversation concerned some third party entirely unknown to him. "You will find, if you examine the writing desk in Mr. Pike's lodgings," Holmes continued, "a stick of dark brown sealing wax and a dish of blue-grey drying sand, both identical to traces I discovered upon the false record and within the court's own sandshaker, where they had no business to be. You will find also a small packet of old visiting cards bearing the name Mr. A. Selden, a relic I imagine that sentiment or carelessness prevented their owner from destroying entirely. A comparison of the handwriting upon those cards with certain notes in Mr. Pike's own hand, which Mr. Lorimer has kindly furnished me, shows an exact correspondence in no fewer than 3 unusual formations of the letter E and the letter we, formations sufficiently distinctive that no reputable expert would attribute them to mere coincidence. Pike rose at last, and I saw that his hands, for all the studied calm of his countenance, were not quite steady. This is a remarkable tissue of supposition, Mr. Holmes, built upon sand and sealing wax and the fancied resemblance of a few letters. I deny it utterly, and I think a court would require rather more than— "A court will have rather more," Holmes said quietly, "for I have not yet mentioned the confession, drafted, I believe, in your own hand and merely copied by Weatherby's trembling one, which contains 3 phrases identical word for word to phrases in a letter of Arthur Selden's preserved among the papers of this very scandal I have described, a letter written 8 years ago, and never, I think, intended to be compared against a confession composed only last week." The silence that followed this final blow seemed to me to stretch on far longer than the few seconds it can actually have occupied. Pike, Selden, as we must now call him, stood a moment longer in that attitude of wounded and dignified denial, and then, quite suddenly, the mildness went out of his face altogether, leaving behind something harder, older, and infinitely more tired, as though a mask long worn had at last grown too heavy to sustain. "Bellamy would have ruined me," said he, in a voice from which every trace of his former deference had entirely vanished. 7 months, and he would have walked free with the whole of his suspicion fresh upon his tongue, and no one to believe an old and buried scandal save the very men whose good opinion I had spent 8 years rebuilding. I did what any man does who has clawed his way back from ruin and finds the ground opening beneath him once again. He looked round at the assembled company, at Bradstreet's grim notebook, at Sir Reginald's stony face, at Weatherby's dawning and painful relief, and something in his bearing seemed, for one moment, almost to ask for understanding rather than pardon. Then Bradstreet rose, and the moment passed, and it was Arthur Selden, not Ambrose Pike, whom the inspector's hand fell upon a moment later, with words I need not set down here, since every reader of these pages will readily supply them for himself. Chapter 10. The True Sentence. It remains only for me to set down, as briefly as the demands of a faithful record allow, the several endings that grew out of that strange afternoon in Lorimer's chambers, endings that reached, in their several ways, into courts and prisons, and the private hearts of men and women who had been drawn, quite against their will, into the orbit of a single falsified word. The correction of the record itself proved, in the event, a matter of surprising swiftness, once the truth had been established beyond reasonable dispute. Sir Reginald Vale, whatever his earlier reluctance to see his court's good name called into question, showed himself, once the true villain stood exposed, a man of unhesitating resolution. He testified himself, with the same grave precision he had brought to 30 years upon the bench, that the sentence he had pronounced was 7 months and no more, and his testimony, joined to the physical evidence Holmes had assembled, the sand, the wax, the spacing of the fatal word, the damning correspondence between an old letter and a new confession, proved more than sufficient to secure an order for Bellamy's immediate release upon the true and lawful term of his sentence, which he had, by the time the order reached Dartmoor, very nearly served in full. Weatherby was summoned before a quiet tribunal of his superiors, and I am glad to record that the outcome, though grave enough in the telling, dealt gently with a man whose only true fault had been an excess of trust in a colleague he had no reason to suspect. He was reprimanded for the carelessness of signing a confession without first submitting it to proper scrutiny, and cautioned, with some severity, against any repetition of so irregular a proceeding. But the charge of corruption, which had hung so heavily over him in the days before Holmes's intervention, was formally and publicly withdrawn. I met him once more some weeks later in the corridor outside the court, and though age and anxiety had left their mark upon him more deeply than before, there was a lightness in his bearing that had been entirely absent at our earlier meetings, the lightness of a man restored, after a period of unjust suspicion, to his own good opinion of himself. Arthur Selden, for it is by that name, and not the borrowed one of Pike, that the newspapers came in time to know him, was arrested upon charges that extended far beyond the immediate matter of Bellamy's sentence. The obstruction of justice and forgery involved in the falsified record proved, upon investigation, to be only the most recent chapter in a career of concealment stretching back to the old scandal of the forged bills of lading, and the further inquiries set in motion by his exposure uncovered several other matters of a similarly shadowed character, in which the mild and helpful Mr. Pike had played a part very different from the one his employers had supposed. He was tried in the following term, and I attended at Holmes's quiet suggestion, though my friend himself characteristically declined to be present at the proceedings, observing only that he had never found satisfaction in watching the machinery he had set in motion complete its final and inevitable turn. I called upon Sir Reginald once, some time after the trial, at Holmes's request, to deliver certain papers connected with the case, and found the old judge in a mood I had not previously witnessed in him, a mood I might almost say of humility, unusual in a man who had spent so many years dispensing judgment upon others. "You may tell Mr. Holmes," said he as I took my leave, "that he has done this court a service I shall not soon forget, and one, I think, that few men living could have rendered. He has shown that justice may be tested, and even shaken without being destroyed, which is a harder and rarer thing, Doctor, than either convicting the guilty or acquitting the innocent, for it requires a man to doubt his own certainties without abandoning them altogether." I thought it, when I repeated the words to Holmes that evening, as fine a tribute as my friend had ever received, though he received it, as he received most such tributes, with no more than a slight and somewhat weary inclination of the head. Of Miss Clara Bellamy I have the happiest report to make. She was present at the prison gates upon the morning of her brother's release, and I understand from Lorimer, who witnessed the reunion and described it to me with an emotion he made no great effort to disguise, that brother and sister stood some minutes together in the raw morning air, saying nothing at all before either could trust their voice sufficiently to speak. James Bellamy, I am told, has since removed to a situation in the north of England, away from the scenes of his misfortune, and writes to his sister regularly of a life gradually, and I trust permanently, restored to its proper and unremarkable course. For my own part, I confess I returned to Baker Street that final evening with a mind more than usually occupied by the singular character of the case we had just concluded, a case in which the crime lay not in violence, nor in any of the more dramatic instruments of wickedness with which our chronicles have so often dealt, but in the quiet, patient corruption of a single sheet of paper, and the trust that paper commanded merely by virtue of its seals and its official language. I said something of this to Holmes as we sat that evening beside our fire, The fog long since lifted from the streets outside, and the lamps of Baker Street burning clear and steady in a sky washed clean by an unexpected rain. "You're struck, I think," said he, filling his pipe with the unhurried deliberation he reserved for such reflective moments, "by how readily we trust the written word above the spoken one, though the written word is so very much easier to falsify and so very much harder to cross-examine. A man who lies to your face may be caught by the flicker of his eye, the hesitation of his voice, 100 small betrayals that no liar, however skilled, can wholly govern. A document commits none of these errors. It sits upon the page in perfect silence, and we mistake that silence for honesty, when it's very often nothing more than the silence of a thing that cannot be questioned. And yet, I said, the truth was there, in the paper itself, for anyone with eyes sharp enough to read it. The raised blot, the spacing, the sand that did not belong. There is the whole of the matter, Watson, in that single observation of yours, though I doubt you intended it as a summary of my methods." He drew upon his pipe, and through the blue smoke that rose and curled toward the ceiling, I saw upon his face that particular expression of quiet contentment which always followed the successful conclusion of a case, tempered, as it so often was, by something graver beneath. Documents, like men, cannot lie perfectly, Watson. They may deceive the careless eye entirely, and the careful eye for a little while, but somewhere, in the spacing of a word, or the colour of a grain of sand, or the raised edge of a drying blot, the truth leaves its mark, faint though it may be, for those with the patience to look for it, and the humility to doubt what everyone else has too readily believed. A court record, a confession, a reputation built over 30 years, and a quiet, forgettable assistant who wished only to be overlooked. All of them appeared upon their surface entirely solid, Watson, until observation found the one grain of sand that did not belong. He said no more upon the subject, and we sat some while longer in the comfortable silence of old friends before a fire, while the last of London's fog dispersed beyond our windows into a clear and quiet night.